Welcome to this sponsor-led presentation. Again, my name is Rose DeCosta. I am External Affairs Manager for Avangrid Renewables, and we're very proud to speak with you today and providing project updates about the various offshore wind projects that are either in construction or in progress. I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Again, Nate Mayo, Director of Public Affairs for Vineyard Wind. We'll go through some of the ins and outs. There are two separate companies represented here who, as a joint venture, pursued Vineyard Wind 1. And that brings the benefit of discussing a number of initiatives that the two companies are working on outside of Vineyard Wind 1 as well. So look forward to getting through that with you folks. And that's us.
And I will just note a housekeeping item. We're going to keep folks on mute. And if you aren't on mute, I might mute for you, but just a PSA. I wanted to start by, introducing ourselves, but also to give some background on the company and the companies, and like Nate mentioned, explain who we are, the projects that we're working on, and how the two companies work together. Avangrid Renewables, just for background, is a US company with onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar operations across the country, operations in 24 states, including traditional utilities through the Avangrid networks. We're also part of the international Iberdrola group, so we're drawing on some international experience in the offshore wind field as well. Go ahead to the next slide. And that's me.
Is this me? Sorry. Got some people joining here a little bit late. So Vineyard Wind LLC is a New Bedford-based company, also with offices in Boston, and was established in 2010 as a joint venture in 2015 after winning around the winning of the first lease area that was identified by the federal government and auctioned off. The company holds two other federal lease areas for development in southern New England. So in addition to the Vineyard Wind 1 joint venture with Avangrid Renewables, the 522 lease area and 544 lease areas, which were acquired later, and we'll show you on some maps in subsequent slides, are the sort of the horizons of future development for the Vineyard Wind solo venture. Rose, if you want to take this, we can hand it back and forth.
Sure. Just to give a more specific overview of how the companies work together in some cases on the Vineyard Wind project, which Nate mentioned is a joint venture between Avangrid Renewables and Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. They, however, did a restructuring earlier this year. So the Park City Wind project and the Commonwealth Wind project, which was only just awarded in December by Massachusetts, are now solely being developed by Avangrid Renewables, while Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners is the sole developer for the lease area that you see on the bottom right in navy, the OCSA 522.
Sorry, Rose, I've lost my mouse, but I can figure it out there. Okay, and another update, and this leads into some of the conversations we'll be having, about the sort of the future of offshore wind in America. In February of this year, the federal government issued another lease offering, an auction for several lease areas off of in the New York Bight, which is roughly off of New Jersey and New York, kind of in that triangular area. CIP and the Vineyard Wind solo venture was successful in actually acquiring that area in the Garnet, and so just over the last few weeks has begun designs on developing that area for future offshore wind development. Likely, these areas have been sort of identified for the New York and New Jersey markets, and it's emblematic of at the federal level and as well at the state level the ambitions and the bright future people see in reaching not only those state goals that Rose is going to talk about, but also federal goals set by the current administration of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by the end of the decade. I apologize that this mouse issue is gonna. There we are. Okay.
Thanks, Nate. And all that to say, backing up for a second, the offshore wind industry in the U.S. is relatively new, but how we got here today, it did not happen overnight. So we're going to give you a little background and perspective on the industry, how it's gotten here so far, and where it's going, as well as more specific information about the projects that Nate and I are working on. So this really all started with Massachusetts and a lengthy siting process of offshore wind on the outer continental shelf off of Massachusetts and Rhode Island coasts. I'll get into more detail in a later slide about that federal siting process. But for state energy procurement, that really started here in Massachusetts with the 2016 Energy Diversity Act, which called for the first state offshore wind procurement goal. And then in the following year, initiated the first offshore wind RFP or procurement process, of which Vineyard Wind was the first. I'm sure Nate will go into more detail later. But the benefits of offshore wind are many, and some of them are listed here. It's a new source of renewable energy. It's a scaled resource. So, for instance, the 800 megawatt project for Vineyard Wind is going to power about 400,000 homes. So quite a large scale source of power. It is also cost effective. So competitive for ratepayers and affordable on our utility bills, and locally made, I guess. So kickstarting a new industry for Massachusetts and for New England, not something that happens every day. So very exciting, and of course helps to address the climate emergency that we're also aware of. Continuing on the thread of why offshore wind, why Massachusetts, a few things. The map on the left shows average wind speeds on off the coast. The red and orange are showing pretty high and sustained and consistent wind speeds. So we have this natural resource, but we also have the population density on the East Coast, the need for this renewable energy. We have some solar and some onshore wind projects in New England, but really our key resource and one of the biggest that we have an opportunity to harness is offshore wind. So that's why we're seeing, kind of the birth of the U.S. industry happening in this region. And I mentioned I'd get a little bit more into the history of how it was sited off of the coast of Massachusetts, and show. I wanted to show a little bit of history. It was a federal process with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, starting back in 2010, where they put an area on the map that you see here. South and just east of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and it's quite a large area, and that is a large area that was pared down over time through a stakeholder engagement process. So conversations with advocacy groups and fisheries, about critical habitat. And valuable fishing grounds, as well as transportation and navigation marine navigation. So all of these factors contributed to narrowing down the areas that you see on the maps in front of you to a much smaller area and the lease areas that you see today, which should be on the next map.
Oh, I guess we're here.
Yes, so it might be a little small, so I apologize, but the map, this is from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management from 2019, so it's even a little outdated for today, but shows the current lease areas south of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, but also the lease areas further down the coast off of New York and down to Virginia and North Carolina. And this is really, you know, it shows the resources off the East Coast, but it's really only the start, I guess, because the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management continues to evaluate coastal areas off of the East Coast, the Gulf, and they're starting to look at the West Coast as well.
Yeah, a good point to add as well, Rose. You know, this map, as she said, is outdated because only a few weeks ago another lease auction was issued. And if you see that Equinor Wind single blue triangle that's where the bulk of those lease areas that showed earlier are. It's important to say to note that the auctioning and the you know the sort of that step of turning the lease over to a developer and giving them the development rights is kind of the mid stride of a very long process. So several years of work goes in for site assessment on the part of the government through those processes where they review endangered species, critical habitat, navigation, and those other issues, then define the lease areas, then auction them, and then the developer steps in at that point. And so with Vineyard Wind 1, we'll discuss sort of the trajectory of the developer's role, which is another several years of development. So when we hear about lease areas being awarded in 2022, we're looking at potentially a 5 to 7 perhaps year development process before these projects are be in actual construction and receive the myriad of permits that they need to be able to be developed.
Yeah, that's a good point, Nate. And like I mentioned at the beginning of that slide, it started in 2010, and I apologize. I think I was speaking a little softly, so let me know if you can't, if it's a little soft. But that process with BOEM started, in 2010, but went all the way to the first lease auction in 2015 and subsequent lease auctions in 2018. So this is, an iterative process and a lengthy one. But I also wanted to point out that, like I mentioned at the beginning, it starts with political leadership by states saying, yes, this is a new energy source that we want coming into our grids. So I wanted to show, just for scale, states on the East Coast that have set offshore wind procurement targets. These are them. They come to just under 40,000 megawatts or 40 gigawatts. And to put that into perspective, the first project that Nate and Vineyard Wind are working on is 800 megawatts. So all up and down the East Coast, we're talking about enough energy to power millions of homes. And this really fits within the Biden administration's target of 30 megawatts. I think it was 30 by 2030, if I recall, Nate.
Correct.
Yeah, yep. So these are really, it seems like a lofty goal considering we only have 7 turbines and probably 40 megawatts operating in US waters currently. But this is, this reflects a achievable goal since there are so many projects in the queue following Vineyard Wind, which is the first on this scale.
And Rose, another piece that remains out. There are further things that are outdated even with this. I shouldn't say it's been passed yet, but Rhode Island just recently, I think there's been some momentum around some additional capacity that the state of Rhode Island is adding. I think another 600 megawatts, and with that, for a state, Rhode Island's about 1 million people. So it's a boosts their ambitions as far as offshore wind becoming a more significant part of their energy mix. So you'll see these numbers perhaps even expand beyond what they are right now. So just wanted to go through kind of the general pathway, and this is a diagram that was put together by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Again, that's the agency that broadly reviews offshore development and has the sort of pole position with respect to managing the siting and permitting of offshore wind facilities in federal waters. So that those earlier darker pieces of this pathway, again usually taking several years of stakeholder engagement, scientific data analysis, and input from the developers, of course, but also endangered species advocates, marine scientists, fisheries, and others, other agencies within the federal government. That portion of it culminates in a lease auction and the granting of a lease, and then the developer steps in and begins site assessment and some of the preliminary more granular work for establishing the knowledge of that area. That green area, segment is a lot of that that research that goes into furthering that knowledge by the developer, which then culminates into the submission of a construction and operations plan, which is ultimately you can call it the kind of the blueprint for the facility, although it does contain a great deal more information about various mitigation proposals, logistics, and other items. That moves through a federal process that is designed to take, I think, about 2 years. And that is also, I should add, in addition to any and all state and local permitting that occurs outside of this process, within those states that when we enter state waters, and then when we make landfall to connect to the grid, there's an extensive permitting process associated with that. So this is a process that's sort of more closer to a decade than a year at this point. And as we see Vineyard Wind 1 commencing construction, sorry to jump the gun on the most exciting news. We see that as having happened in this case 11 years after the beginning of BOEM's sort of initial identification of potential lease areas, and about 6 or 7 years after the developer began our work. That has been a bit prolonged by a handful of delays here and there that are probably not as likely to be anticipated with future projects, but it gives you a sense of the timeline and the amount of effort, long-standing effort that needs to happen by the developer, by agencies and regulators, but also critically by advocates and stakeholders who play such a critical role in advocating that these projects are done and that they're done responsibly and providing valuable input. These projects are built for communities to power our homes and businesses, and they're built on behalf of those communities. So that process is very involved. So Vineyard Wind 1, as we've been talking about, is the first of what purports to be many offshore wind facilities to be developed in the next several years and a couple of decades, perhaps. An 800 megawatt project. It was the first project awarded, a major project awarded in the United States in 2018. We had begun that federal permitting process prior to the award, and then after some supplemental and sort of more longitudinal assessments on offshore wind done by the federal government, our permitting was completed in 2021. It's 15 miles south of the islands at its closest point, as you can see on the map on the right, and adheres to an agreement by developers to promote shared use and consistency across all lease areas. In the Massachusetts, Rhode Island lease area of 1.1 nautical mile consistent spacing. There's a lot of technicalities that go into why that is a trade-off as far as design optimization and things like that. But the message was clear that consistency is needed across lease areas for fishing and navigation and other uses that require that consistency. The project originally was proposed to have over 100 turbines, but due to the rapid evolution and refinement of wind turbine technology, offshore wind turbine technology, That number was cut by a quarter and then cut by a quarter again. So what we've ended up with, and is in our final construction plan, is actually only 62 turbines of 13 megawatts each. So as they've gotten bigger, in order to fill that 800 megawatts, we need fewer turbines, fewer turbine locations. This is going to power 400,000 homes in Massachusetts and reduce our carbon emissions by 1.6 million metric tons, the equivalent of roughly a third of a million cars coming off the road. It's a really exciting step. It is one major step. And as Rose and I mentioned in the previous slides, there are ambitions that this be the first of dozens, perhaps, of facilities that will deliver the same benefits multifold in the coming years. So the timeline, as we discussed, 2017 was when we began. We went through that process, the federal, state, and local level, and began construction at the end of last year. In 2022 and 2023 is when offshore installation operations will commence, and we will be scheduled to be delivering first power in late 2023. The final sort of commissioning and moving to the operation stage is anticipated for early 2024. And it's been a long and very exciting road that's been built on many collaborations, and this will be the case with future efforts, and of course the ones that Rose is going to talk about, that Avangrid is pursuing, and those that Vineyard Wind and CIP will be pursuing in the future. A host community agreement recognizing that the communities, the shoreside communities that are hosting the infrastructure or are closest to the action are a critical player in this. We were very proud to have negotiated a first of its kind host community agreement with the town of Barnstable that delivers benefits and safeguards to that town and allows the project to be constructed near shore and onshore in an orderly manner. Also agreements with the town of Nantucket, and then a long-standing agreement with Vineyard Power, which is a major community leader on the island of Martha's Vineyard, which really led the charge in those early years prior to Vineyard Wind's existence about community-led processes and interests to feed these to feed into the way we design these projects. And then environmental protection stands as our highest and most critical priority, and we've engaged nonprofits, research organizations in many ways to ensure that we're building the project in the most responsible and least impactful way, with landmark protections to especially the North Atlantic right whale, as well as commitments to avian and fisheries research, and partnerships across the board, and investments in innovation that will allow for offshore wind to be developed in a more refined way in the context of these critically endangered species and precious resources, but also that will contribute to the broader science and knowledge of our oceans beyond just its interaction with offshore wind. So that's fisheries data and research, and that's collaborating with research institutions, some of the foremost in the world, really, in southern New England. I think of SMAS, New England Aquarium, Woods Hole Oceanographic. There are a lot of really valued players that have contributed to enrich the research and our knowledge of the areas where we're working. Another commitment to workforce development. This industry will need thousands of people to work on these jobs, on these projects, building them in succession, and then of course the operations and maintenance. So we've made significant investments there, and more is needed, as we go project to project to anchor investment here, not just because it's the sort of the duty of developers to deliver those benefits, but also because these projects are going to need the workers, the expertise, and they're going to need to have greater access to the technical resources that are going to be needed to build Vineyard Wind 1, its successors, and then perhaps dozens of other projects that will be pursued in the coming decades. I spilled the beans there, but we were so proud to have finally broken ground after the first offshore wind facility proposed in America was the ill-fated Cape Wind proposal, which faltered after a decade and a half of work, and was originally proposed in 2001. So we found ourselves just north of 20 years of when offshore wind was first pursued in this country to when we finally broke ground in the town of Barnstable at an event that was a real great culmination of state, local, federal leaders, community leaders, and advocates across the environmental and labor spectrum. It was a wonderful beginning to, a real beginning to an industry that shows a huge amount of promise and is really exciting for all of us to be a part of. I did want to just nerd out a little bit here. Construction has begun. And some of that looks like traditional road work and infrastructure. Some people might mistake it for a sewer, and actually we are collaborating on some sewer projects with the town of Barnstable, which helps address a critical local environmental concern of nutrient loading and basically pollutants going into their coastal and inshore waters. One of the great of many features to minimize impact with these types of projects. In the upper left, you see it's the description of a technique called horizontal directional drill. So what this does is it allows us to work set back from the beach when we want to install the cable that will transition from the offshore to the onshore and be connected to the grid. And the old school traditional techniques were to cut a huge notch in the shore side and lay cable in that traditional way. This HTD method allows us to avoid impacts to that precious and very sensitive intertidal zone. So you'll see that tube that's sort of diagonal. It's making its way down deep under the beach and below the sea floor in order to create that transition with minimal impact. We then will be shifting to offshore construction. The most interesting, I guess, in this slide, at least for me, is down in the lower left there. You see what is known as a jet plow, a hydro plow, or a vertical injector, a handful of very similar techniques, which basically confine this undersea cable installation, which needs to be sufficiently below the seabed to be out of the marine environment as best as possible, confines that to a narrow notch, which is customarily used for data cables and power cables that go across various water bodies, including some of those in and around the Cape and Islands. And those minimally invasive techniques provide the smallest footprint and are shown to have very rapid recovery of benthic organisms and any kinds of species and habitat that is impacted there temporarily. We're working out of New Bedford. I'm looking out at the New Bedford skyline here. We're proud to be stationed in this nationally important harbor for much of our work, hiring local scout vessels and support services in this major multi-billion-dollar effort. I mentioned the marine mammal protections that are myriad. They involve extensive amounts of monitoring and contributions to research, as well as very tight time of year restrictions that were worked out long and hard with regulators and environmental advocates to ensure that these projects, which are really for an environmental purpose but a global one, are built in a way that minimizes and avoids impacts to those precious species, which are a major part of this puzzle that we're trying to solve. Climate change is impacting them. We want to ensure that those projects that seek to address climate change will also avoid impacts and in some cases hope to further the protections of those species. This is, as we mentioned before, that we were able to secure basically the most advanced and efficient turbine available on the market, which allowed us to shrink the footprint significantly of the project. And that's a GE model, which produces 13 megawatts, which, if I can do my quick math here, about 6,000 or 7,000 homes powered by each individual turbine, each individual piling installation and turbine. So it's very exciting to see the level of efficiency, meaning we're reducing the footprint of these and getting more bang for your buck. We don't, it's good to try and minimize the sort of overall footprint of these, and technological innovations are allowing us to do that. We have an agreement to do operations and maintenance that we're very proud of out of Vineyard Haven. Local jobs anywhere, but on the islands in southeastern Mass are certainly a major priority, and it's very exciting that we were able to work on a partnership that is going to station long-term jobs on Martha's Vineyard that are going to be associated with the sort of ongoing work of maintaining and keeping Vineyard Wind 1 going. So it's a very exciting thing. Lots of training involved that we're investing in, and lots of job recruiting as well. All right, I've talked enough here and I'm getting a little hoarse, so I'll hand it over to Rose to talk about some of Avangrid's exciting projects.
Yes, and Vineyard Wind 1 is nothing if not exciting, and I'm very proud to see it in the construction phase now. But I'm going to talk about the next couple of projects in the queue that Avangrid Renewables is working on, and these are two projects that will be located immediately southeast of Vineyard Wind 1. So this next one is Park City Wind. And both of these projects, as well as Vineyard Wind 1, are interconnecting to the New England electric grid in the town of Barnstable, where there is capacity to connect to the grid. So Park City Wind is very similar, on paper to Vineyard Wind 1 in scale. It's an 804 megawatt project powering about 400,000 homes. You've heard it all just now from Nate, but similarly reducing pollution by 1.1 million tons annually, and equivalent of removing about 200,000 vehicles from roadways. And this is a project that was procured or put out the RFP for the projects by the state of Connecticut. So while the power is going into Massachusetts, it is part of the New England electric grid and adds to the renewable energy portfolio for the grid. And also similarly offers an affordable cost for ratepayers. And so, similar to Vineyard, we have some commitments to executing a project labor agreement with the region's unions, investments in workforce training and supply chain integration, and redeveloping an underutilized commercial waterfront site that's in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for which the project is named the Park City, as Bridgeport is known. And we're continuing to build on the excellent example set by the Vineyard team, and we will have a host community agreement with the town of Barnstable, where the onshore infrastructure will be located, as well as Nantucket, where the cables, near where the cables go through. And the project to follow, which is again very early stages, it was awarded by Massachusetts in December this past year. It's a slightly bigger project and quite an exciting one. I think you see with each new offshore wind project, additional investments in the economic benefits onshore. While there are thousands of turbines spinning off of Europe currently, and it's a kind of a mature industry that's been around for quite a few decades. It's new here in the US. We don't have the same supply chain set up as Europe. So a lot of the components for these early projects are coming over from facilities in Europe, but as the US as more and more projects are in development, you're seeing more investments in US infrastructure and manufacturing. And that's what you're seeing with the Commonwealth Wind project, which I'll get to in a moment. But it's a 1,232 megawatt project powering, going into the grid in West Barnstable. And like I mentioned, this is a Massachusetts project. Reduces pollution annually by about 14.8 million tons, about just over 300,000 cars annually coming off the roadways. That's the equivalent. And again, creates a further investment in the region's economy. And like Park City, is building on the relationships and the excellent example of Vineyard Wind 1. And we'll work towards an agreement with the town of Barnstable, and further, we'll have diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative as part of the project, and integrating local workforce and local supply chain into further integrating and offering opportunities in this new industry. And like I mentioned, about the investments in manufacturing and really solidifying the industry here in the Northeast and in the US. The Commonwealth Wind project, part of the proposal includes developing a second port in Massachusetts from which offshore wind projects can be staged or marshaled, and that will be Salem. There's a site of a former coal plant in Salem where this working waterfront will be redeveloped for the Commonwealth Wind project and future projects, which is exciting. So right now, New Bedford is really the big port facility for staging these projects. Secondarily, as far as manufacturing, the second photo there is another former coal-fired plant at Brayton Point, which is going to be transformed into a subsea cable manufacturing facility. So one of the major components of an offshore wind project are the cables that connect it to shore. And so Prysmian Group has committed to invest in a new facility there. So quite exciting there in Somerset, Massachusetts. And just to put in perspective, while Vineyard Wind 1 is in the installation phase now, Park City Wind is going through the permitting process, and we aim to complete that next year, probably late next year, and start installation soon thereafter. Whereas Commonwealth Wind is only in the early stages of federal permitting, and state permitting will start sometime later this year. And maybe a little bit less exciting for some, but the onshore route to connect to the grid, it's like Nate mentioned, similar to traditional utility projects, and Park City and likely Commonwealth Wind will use similar installation techniques like Nate mentioned, including horizontal directional drilling to go underneath the beach to avoid disturbance to the environment.
Yeah, and one of the reasons, Rose and I have been talking about this, both the projects, these onshore routes, while seemingly sort of less exciting and kind of a footnote, and some of these are critically important, but the collaboration with the town of Barnstable, those water bodies that you see inland have been degraded extensively by development and basically the use of on-site septic, which chokes them off, but creates nutrient loading, which is one of the great sort of state environmental concerns, and probably the number one localized environmental concern on Cape Cod. And these projects, we've been able to collaborate with the town of Barnstable, with Vineyard Wind 1, and as I understand as well with Park City Wind, on co-locating sewer, facilitate moving forward their critical efforts to remove some of that nutrient loading so that these water bodies that are iconic and critical pieces of the local ecosystem can return to balance. So we talk about these big lofty things about climate change and the global impacts, and we are also seeing on the ground these lines mean something more than just an underground piece of copper that's bringing that offshore wind to residents. It's also playing a part in doing something really important locally. So we're proud of that on both sides, I think.
Yeah, good point, Nate. Thank you for reminding me. It was, kind of a happy coincidence that, these projects are lining up with the town's own sewer master plan. So the collaboration that's come about is really exciting for the region. And what you're seeing here is Commonwealth Wind's onshore proposal. We are at early stages of developing the plan here. But the project would potentially come to shore at Dowses Beach in Barnstable, where there's a sizable parking lot for staging the HDD, and will interconnect an existing substation in West Barnstable, for those who are familiar with the area. And I'll just note that we've got a couple more slides and then we'll get to questions. And I see there are a few in the chat, but as you think of questions, feel free to add them anytime. We'll be wrapping up in just a moment with the slides. But just to put a little more detail on our community benefits, our host community agreement with the town of Barnstable, where our project is really most visible onshore. for the Park City Wind project, and similar to what Vineyard Wind had done, have a host community agreement with Barnstable that provides mitigation payments above the property taxes that will be assessed for the infrastructure in town. And we'll make it one of the largest taxpayers in Barnstable, but with very little demand on town services. For those who are familiar with town finances, is quite a feat. So and like Nate and I mentioned earlier, we're continue to coordinate on the sewer project with the town, minimizing the length of time that roadways have to be closed or diverted, and minimizing the impacts to residents. And continuing to do work mostly outside of the summer months. We know that the Cape is a tourist draw, and it's a big part of the region's economy. So doing this work outside of summer months was quite important.
I think when we go into Barnstable, I just wanted to say that the trend here, certainly learning on the mistakes of earlier past challenges of earlier past developments, is that at each level of stakeholder, this type of involvement is critical, and to taking input and to being flexible and to sort of redefining the project. So we've done that with fisheries, with marine mammals, with labor, with the communities that we're working on, and that really is the theme that we hope is going to bear out through those future projects we've been discussing. Sorry to cut you off there, Rose, but I'm just I'm capturing the excitement of this as one case study in many stakeholder engagement efforts that we've been involved in.
Very true. Which I'll get to a little bit on the next slide, but thank you for the preview. And before we do that, just one point on the previous slide. Environmental mitigation. We understand these projects have a footprint onshore, a minimal one. Most of the infrastructure is underground, but our substations include some of the strongest or most state-of-the-art environmental protection. And we're also, our feet are held to the fire as far as open space, right? Because this does have a footprint, and where there is necessary tree clearing, hopefully minimal tree clearing, but there are open space requirements as well as part of the permitting process. Wanted to touch briefly on a few of the community engagement efforts, fisheries, but also tribal, which will be on the next slide. Similar to the work, building on the work that the Vineyard Project started with baseline fishery surveys, Park City Wind is continuing some of these surveys. So collecting baseline data from the outer continental shelf where these projects will be built, collecting baseline data on those commercially important species so we can track the impact that construction may have and long-term operation may have. Recognizing also that that many folks recognize that climate change is one of the bigger impacts as opposed to infrastructure like this, but still very important to measure and mitigate where you can. Tribal engagement. So tribes, Native American tribes in the region have a seat at the table, especially when it comes to our geotechnical and geophysical marine surveys. And they're part of our National Historic Preservation Review. And we're also developing relationships within the tribes in the towards workforce development opportunities as well. And wanted to touch briefly, these projects are held to quite a high environmental standard when it comes to threatened species or protected species, like the North Atlantic right whale, critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, I should say. So all vessels have to have dedicated observers and requirements to cease operations in some cases when they are in the area, as well as time of year restrictions on certain operations. like pile driving, and vessel speed restrictions as well. And I know we covered a lot, but I hope you all have you have a lot of questions as well. And I see there are just a couple in the chat. But just pausing before we go to the questions, Nate and I are available for questions if you have any after this. So feel free to screenshot our contact information, or we'll also put it in the chat if that's helpful.
Yeah, and you can find us online too at our various websites, which would be pretty accessible. We encourage further outreach. Some of these topics, these are some of the most complex projects, infrastructure-wise. I would say, ever devised, in this country. Obviously, they're being done extensively in Europe, but so there's a lot of detail. Some that may bear out from a longer conversation offline, because there's just so much complexity to it. All right. I will stop sharing here if that's okay. Get to some of these questions. Can I make?
All right. I think I'll take the first question from the Mass Land Trust. Is there hope that since original hurdles to wind power in New England have been largely overcome? I think they're referencing the project delays for Vineyard from the past couple of years. Is there hope that permitting in the future will go more quickly and thus faster implementation? I think that very much is the hope. I think you've seen, with the first project Vineyard going through the federal process, there was often a learning process both on the project side, but also on the regulator side, as we work together to make sure, that the process is thorough and can be upheld for future project review. So yes, I think you'll see a more regular schedule from federal permitting.
Yeah, I could take the second one regarding migratory birds. That it's been obviously a one of the most focused upon subsets of species associated with offshore wind development from the very beginning, from those early years in the late 2000s, early 2010s, as far as siting goes. But that work continues on. So certain considerations were made, and actually some of those areas that were cleaved off of the original area were due expressly to certain bird habitats and migratory bird pathways. Audubon has been a major voice at the highest level, a major proponent, but also one seeking to ensure that our work is done, that the research that's necessary to ensure minimize impact and understand any impacts. That also goes to the shore side thing. I mean, shore birds, birds do have a land side interest that we need to protect as well. But some really exciting avian research has been done using what, I mean, it's just baffling cutting edge technology that we've done to sort of map out some of the bird movements around the Vineyard Wind 1 lease area. And we're also hoping that this stuff becomes collaborative across lease areas, because of course these installations may be pursued by different developers, but they're all they're interrelation with the ecosystem there knows no developers bounds. So some of the aerial based avian survey work has been just breathtaking what they've been able to do as far as species identification. One of the things that was noted to me was that even some of these subspecies that have only minor variations can now, with the level of granularity of some of the imagery they're doing, they can now pick up those distinctions. And then there's been years of wide-ranging audio and visual surveys done around these areas to sort of give us the best grounding of what impacts if any there will be. You can never claim zero impact in something like that, but we have a pretty good map and something that we collaborate with regulators, with those really interested in avian conservation. So it's another exciting feature. I think one where we could go on for quite some time with that. I could take the next one about in energy storage. Storage is the next horizon, and there was, even with the first Massachusetts procurement, an interest in encouraging storage, a storage feature to these projects. It's sort of come into the vanguard, and they become more efficient ultimately. At that point in 2017, and I guess it was late 17, early 18 when we submitted our bid, there was a piece within that which dedicated funds to resiliency and the resiliency and affordability program, which is established by Vineyard Wind 1, which is sort of becoming operational now, and that seeks to actually build on what we know and expand from what we know to battery storage projects that are synergies for critical infrastructure in the cities and towns that we're working with. So that's in essence battery projects that are connected to solar and those kinds of things. There is a great need for this sort of grid 2.0 to capture storage, but that's a whole another energy discussion again that could we could spend all day discussing.
Yeah. And similar, I think some other companies are starting to look at, are doing pilot programs around producing green hydrogen with renewable energy projects like offshore wind. So that's another new aspect that's the industry, renewable energy industry is examining. I can take some of the next ones if you'd like, Nate.
Go right ahead. Yeah.
So a follow-up question, are we working with any mentors from European projects as guidance? And yes, absolutely. Our both Vineyard Wind and Avangrid Renewables draw from our European partners, our international partners, and the experience that they've had in Europe building and mitigating impacts to the project. So yes, very, very good point.
I would add to that something we often say is that from the CIP and Avangrid Renewable side and our partners, it's likely that every single offshore wind facility that's ever been built in the world, that there's a member of our team somewhere who's been involved in that. There's decades of experience, and both of those companies for Vineyard Wind 1 drew upon that, and we retain that expertise for future projects.
And then another question from Jim about the usable life of a turbine and whether that's 20 years or I think it's more like 25 or 30, but yes, there's a useful life to these projects, to a wind turbine, offshore wind turbine, like most infrastructure, including the cars that we drive. After 20 or 25 years, it's not as economical or useful to keep that car on the road. There's more efficient models. So you see the same with projects like this. At the end of the useful life, the project will either be decommissioned or decommissioned for new model turbines. So
yeah, that whole set of decision-making process though is accounted for, but does happen in out years. One tidbit that kind of blew my mind when I heard about it is that as these are getting more efficient, the turbines of when we started, the most commercially available, the largest commercially available was 8 megawatts. We were at 13 just a few years later. Not only those refinements don't necessarily just don't translate just to larger always. I mean that is a component of it, but it's only a single component to making them more efficient. But even in some cases, software updates and more advanced computer technology within the turbines themselves with no physical changes can actually result in greater efficiencies. So they're finding, repowering and those other things are a horizon, of course, that everyone's looking at to continue these assets being able to generate. We do though have, in all these cases, a lease term which has a finite amount of time, after which we are bound to decommission and basically return the lease area back to the public, back to the federal government. There is obviously a policy opening for repowering and extending or things like that, but that would clearly be the prerogative of policymakers and regulators at that time.
That's a good point, Nate. The decommissioning process would go through a similarly rigorous environmental review for decommissioning plan prior to implementation, similar to what you see when you're permitting these projects in the first place. And that kind of leads into the next question that Jim, there was a question about from Joel. About onshore turbines or smaller installations. a point that I wanted to make. In addition to decommissioning a project at the end of its life, in the from the moment a project is operational, and for that 2 or 3 decade period, these offshore wind projects are maintained daily with an operations and maintenance team. And Nate mentioned the Vineyard Wind 1 base for that will be in Vineyard Haven on Martha's Vineyard. But these, having a project of this scale means that they're being regularly maintained. And I think that's one of the issue that you see with smaller installations, when it's 1 or 2 turbines on shore, is a maintenance contracts or getting parts for them can be an issue or take more time. So I think you'll see, you wonder, and we get this question often. I see a onshore turbine in my town. It's barely running half the time, and that's the complaint that folks have is is this actually going to work? And there's still a lot of skeptical folks out there, but I can tell you there's a big difference between the scale of the offshore wind turbines and the onshore turbines. So I can't speak to the onshore ones too much, except that they're limited in capacity by the size of the components that you can move down a roadway or move down a railway. So offshore, it's a different scale turbine, quite a bit larger.
Yeah, would want to add too. There are initiatives that developers are looking at, and that state lawmakers are looking at to ease the ability for collaboration between municipalities and these facilities, because ultimately, from a range of perspectives, and I would include avian in that, some of the research that has created a pretty clear distinction between certain siting of onshore versus offshore and how birds will interact with offshore, typically with avoidance behavior, staying outside of the area, although those onshore, which are accustomed to flying in closer proximity in that context to structures, that there can be more impacts, and certain siting applications have shown some problems there onshore, although some have been quite successful. The idea, though, is that with greater efficiency and being able to connect to the wires, connect the wires from offshore or from down the road, that is a great opportunity. The permitting matrix, the involvement of these projects, and we mentioned Vineyard Power earlier, they had sought to kind of see if communities could build their own offshore wind facilities. It is so onerous that really requires that partnership and have multiple players involved. But there are a number of efforts afoot and ways, folks on this call in Massachusetts and other states can be active in supporting those efforts to allow municipalities and allow communities and neighborhoods even to have more access to these, because there's certain sort of artificial barriers at the moment that disallow that direct connection. I would want to dovetail that to Jim's question about how it will be sold to the consumer. The way this works technically is the utilities are sort of issued, through a law or regulation to purchase offshore wind. The utilities themselves issue a request for proposals. Offshore wind developers bid into that based on price and a number of other factors, and then are selected to sell to in this case, the constellation of Massachusetts providers. So the mass utilities purchase the offshore wind, which then becomes part of the energy mix that they sell to the consumer. What's been amazing about it is, the prices have plummeted and it's become competitive to other sources of new generation. And so we're not seeing the types of price impacts that were feared 15, 20 years ago. We're seeing savings in some cases. Vineyard Wind 1 is slated to save over $1 billion for ratepayers, and there are several other savings estimates for various projects up and down the East Coast.
Yeah, and I would note, it's not just, and I know we're right at 3, so we'll be, and this is the last question, but I'll note that it's in Massachusetts, it's mostly Eversource and National Grid are the utilities that Nate mentioned, but there are also some municipal utilities, municipal light plants, as some folks on the call may be familiar with. And we were excited with the recent Commonwealth Wind project announcement that project will have a contract with Energy New England, which is a consortium of about 30 or so municipal light plants. So
I have to jump, folks. I really appreciate sorry to cut you off there. I have to jump to another critical item, folks, but I do encourage everyone on here to reach out if there's any further questions. We'd love to have a follow-up conversation. I'm sure Rose feels the same. There's some exciting initiatives happening and the future's bright. So thanks everyone for joining. Sorry to have to jump here.
Thank you, Nate. I think we've
Thank
reached
you,
the end
everyone.
of our questions. So
All right.
I'll put my email in the chat, and I believe this is recorded, so it will be available through the conference website.